Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Pagan's Witchy Corner. My name is Pagan, and today I am joined by a guest who I have loved for years. And if you listen to my original podcast way back in the day, Mhara was actually on that show, which that show is no longer in production. It's been out of production for a while. But Mhara Starling, welcome back to the show. I'm so happy you're here.
I'm so happy to be here too. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It has been a hot minute since we talked. I think actually you were on Chaos and Shadow way back in the day. And that show, like I said before, has been out of production, and it was right after your Welsh Witchcraft book came out. And so you came on then, and that was a great interview. Learned so much about the Welsh culture through that book, which I loved. But now you are back with two amazing books, which are Welsh Fairies and the a Mabinogi, and I hope I got that right. Welsh is such a hard language.
Oh gosh, yeah, it feels surreal now to be able to look at how far I've come in the last few years, even though it feels like it's just kind of gone in the flutter of a fairy's wings. It's just gone out of nowhere. So yeah, it's strange to think that back then I only had the one book, and now I've got three out and another in production that's about to release early next year. It's rather ridiculous.
That's amazing. I'm so excited that you have another one coming because, like, obviously, I'm a fan. I'm going to continue to gush about all your books. And for everybody who's listening, go pick up copies. They're amazing. Like I was telling Mara pre-show, I've read Welsh Fairies twice now. And it's been an amazing thing. Literally loved it. The audiobook, also, if you're an audiobook fan, is amazing. It is like listening to someone tell you bedtime stories in the best of ways with this beautiful, soft British voice. I love it so much. So yes, just go buy the books. You will not be sad about it at all. The only thing I can tell you about the differences between them is they both talk about obviously Welsh mythology, and one covers the fairy aspect, but the Mabinogi one, that one is a little more academic, which is not bad. I love both. I love a good academic book, and I also love a good witchy book with some sass and flair, and they both have that. So just go buy them. Go forth. You can come back. We'll still be here. It's fine. But we're going to talk all about these books, and we're going to start with the Mabinogi one because that one was probably didn't expect it. I also didn't know what I was getting when I requested a copy from the publicist. So when I was like, I don't know what this is, but I know it's by Mara, so I know it's going to be amazing regardless. And then when I got it, I was like, oh, okay, so this is about like the whole almost divine system, because like there's not really gods, but there's kind of gods. It's very confusing. It's kind of that weird, thing with the divine when you're just like, are you a god? Are you a fairy? Are you a human? I'm not sure. Maybe all three. Yes. But it's been such an amazing journey, and it was so interesting to learn about, and I loved every aspect of it. I loved mythology as a whole. Um, but kind of diving in, what drew you to actually, writing about the Mabinogi? And also, what was like a particular branch or character that really sucked you in that made you just go, yes, I want to write a book about this?
Oh gosh, well, the Mabinogi in general has been something that's been kind of framing my life for the entirety of my existence. I remember when I first started primary school, which was when I was around maybe 6 years old. I can't quite remember how old you are when you first start school. I remember telling my teachers that I had a love and a fondness for fairies and witches and mythology and magic and such. And they kind of directed me towards Welsh mythology. They were like, well, if you like stories that feature magic and mysteries and, anything that delves into the other and fairy and such, then you need to read the Mabinogi. And so I remember being read the stories initially at school, being told the stories by my teachers, some of which they would just tell off the top of their heads. They wouldn't have a book in their lap. They would just tell us the stories. And I remember back then, these stories were not really presented to us as stories, if that makes sense at all. They were kind of presented to us as though they were actual parts of our history and culture. These were things that actually genuinely happened. So to my 6, 7, 8-year-old brain, I could absolutely absolutely visualize a giant crossing over the Irish Sea to go and save his sister. I could completely see the idea of a king ruling over the entirety of the kingdom of Gwynedd, who also happens to be a wizard, and he punishes people by transforming them into animals. And these stories were just quite captivating. And when I was at that age, going to primary school and such, we also, because it was a Welsh medium school, because we were a school that predominantly taught via the Welsh language, my first language, we did celebrate the stories quite intensely. So at Christmas, at around like special times in the year, we would go and we would watch theatrical versions of these shows. One that I mentioned at the beginning of my Pagan Portals and Mabinogi is a pantomime that I went to see. And for those outside of the UK, pantomimes are something you must experience at some point. You have to experience. They are ridiculous in all of the best ways. They're almost like if you imagine a Broadway musical, but the actors don't really take themselves that seriously. There's a lot of audience participation, and obviously they're not as funded as Broadway musicals. They're done for fun around Christmas and New Year time, and it's mostly children that they are performed for. So it's usually they take the idea of a fairy tale or a myth or something that's quite prominent in culture that is somewhat oldie worldy in its feel, and then they kind of modernize it. So they add in all these modern elements like modern music and such. And when I was around, I think maybe 9 or 10, we went to see a pantomime version of the second branch of the Mabinogi, which is titled Branwen ver Hir. And it's really funny to think about the contrast because as a modern day pagan now, the way that people approach these stories and these mythologies, they look at them as these very serious, very mythological texts that they must study really intensely. And, I'm guilty of that too. I wrote a whole bloody book about it. But at the same time, we have this kind of tongue in cheek culture in Wales where we like to laugh at each other, we like to laugh at ourselves. So if I were to tell somebody who knew what a pantomime was, that I went to watch a pantomime of the second branch of the Mabinogi, they would first and foremost go, how does that work? Because if you've not read the second branch of the Mabinogi, it is essentially a horror film. It's
Hmm.
like you've got a woman married off to a man in order to forge an alliance between two kingdoms, and then the brother or the kind of step brother that she has decides that he's offended that his sister or his half sister was married off to somebody without him giving his permission, patriarchy and all that. And so his decision in that moment when he realizes that, oh, my sister or my half sister has been married off to someone without my consent and permission, I know what I'll do. I'll go mutilate her new husband's horses. I'll go cut off their tails and their lips and their ears. And then, in order to appease the Irish, which that's the other nation that's in that story, in order to appease the Irish king who's now just been offended because his horses has been mutilated, the king of Britain gives him a cauldron which can bring the dead back to life, except kind of as warrior zombies. And all of this happens. There's so much more that happens that's terrifying as well. There's a child that's thrown onto a fire. There are these two giants, which are somewhat peaceful, just a little ugly and scary. And people decide to burn them alive in a massive house made of metal. It's just a rather intense story. Everyone dies in the end. It's not fun. So telling someone this was turned into a really fun, hokey musical is kind of like, how? How did they do that? And I will tell you, they did it very well, very, very well. And mixed in with that production were like modern music and such. And it captivated my theatrical queer little self when I was a child. And I think that was the kind of driving force when I was younger to understand these stories better. They were part and package of our living bardic tradition, and they kind of captivated the part of us that knew that the past didn't have to be this stodgy thing to study. We could look at the past in a mythopoetic way. And so I love the Mabinogi for that reason. And I've always, always wanted to write about about it. And of course, through Welsh Witchcraft, Welsh Fairies, I did get to write bits about it, but
Mhm.
I've always said I wanted to kind of give a little bit of an introductory guide that people could pick up and go, okay, I don't know how to deal with these stories. I don't know how to interpret them. I don't know how to approach them. And the book that I wanted to write was going to be like this introductory guide for the person who has no idea how to get in on it. And then, out of nowhere, Moon Books, they reached out to me and they said, would you like to write a pagan portal for us on the Mabinogi? And I thought, this is it. This is my in. I can do it now. So I've always loved the Pagan Portal series because they're slim volumes. They're
Mhm.
only around 20 to 30,000 words. I remember when I was younger and I didn't have much money, the Pagan Portals books were always my go to, especially because as I was like a university student, I didn't have much time to read books on witchcraft and such, even though I really wanted to. And you could read one of those in a night
Oh, yeah.
if you really dedicated. You could just sit there a whole day, lazy Sunday, and just read the entire book from cover to cover. So when they invited me, I couldn't say no because they'd been such a big part in my life in becoming the witch that I am today. So I thought that would be the perfect time to put forth this Pagan Portals, a Mabinogi, which acts as this introductory guide. And I hope my true hope and wish with the book is that people will pick it up and be as captivated by these stories and realize the intense magic and wisdom that's woven into them as I realized when I was a child growing up with these stories as part and package of my life and culture.
I love that. And I love how it fits so nicely with your other books. It's kind of like that whole, okay, you've gotten a taste of this. Now here's the lore. Go read that. And then it's like, now you can take the lore and go have fun with it. And also meet all of these other, like, kind of like sub characters that are, part of like the fairies and the different beings and all the different entities and all the things that kind of encompass Welsh mythology and its whole entirety. But I love how the Mabinogi is just kind of that whole thing of where it is the tie that just brings everything together. And your book literally does that. It's just like, here's all of this really in depth stuff that spans multiple centuries. Here, it's 100 pages. You can't get lost. It's wonderful. So kind of bringing that in and talking about the, different ways of kind of introducing the Mabinogi, especially because they're so rich with transformation and sovereignty and obviously that moral complexity. What do you think that readers may struggle with the most and why? This is one of those questions where I'm going to make you think.
Yes, very much think. I think if I were to give a little bit of a jokey answer first, I would say the first thing that people might get stuck on are the words, the names, the
Oh gosh,
pronunciations.
yes.
'Cause, Welsh is an interesting language for those who are used to English. I would always argue that English is far more complicated than Welsh is, but we're more accustomed to English at the minute. And when we see Welsh words, especially for people who only speak English, I think there's this tendency to go, "Oh my God, what is that? Where are the vowels?" And all that. And that's a joke that we unfortunately here in Wales have to deal with quite often is the where is the vowels. And I tried to make that a little bit easier for people by including a pronunciation guide and a little bit of an introduction to the Welsh language at the back. Because at the end of the day, if you really, really look into it, it's actually fairly easy because Welsh is a phonetic language. And by that, what we mean is that every letter is pronounced exactly the same all the time. So whereas with English, the letter E or the letter Y or the letter I might be pronounced completely differently depending on where it is in a word and such. That doesn't happen in Welsh. We consistently pronounce letters exactly as they are in the alphabet. There's only, I think, two major exceptions with that, and that's the letter Y and the letter E. So it's like if the letter E comes after a vowel, so if it comes after the letter A, then instead of being pronounced air, it's pronounced like more of an E sound.
Mhm.
And similarly for the letter Y, which is in the title of the book, Mabinogi, I get a lot of people who come up to me and they go, oh, your book, why Mabinogi? And I'm like, it's not why. So well, some people will even go E Mabinogi, which I understand as well. But that there is both a letter in our alphabet, but also a full word. So the at the beginning of Mabinogi means the. So or is usually the in Welsh. So it's the Mabinogi. But sometimes the letter Y is also pronounced more like a I noise as well, but it's usually in multisyllabic words and such. And then we also have little rules like we have what we call torbach in Welsh, which is a little roof which sits on top of some letters, usually vowel letters. To indicate that that sound is elongated. So, like if you see a little circumflex or little roof, as we call them in Welsh, above the letter A, then that means that rather than being pronounced ah, it's pronounced ah. So it's like elongated, stretched.
Gotcha.
So I try to like basically cover that in the back of the book because people do get stumped by the language a lot
Hmm.
sometimes, which I find really fascinating because the language itself is something that carries culture and tradition and magic within Welsh tradition. And I think that's something that is also another struggle for people who come to this for the first time because we live in a world nowadays where everything is very neatly compartmentalized and organized. I
Hmm.
like to always think that we're living in the aftermath of the 19th century where we were obsessed with classifications, whether it was classifications of the natural world, classifications of species, classifications of science. You know, in the late 18th through to the 19th century, people like Charles Darwin were coming along and trying to classify every single thing. It wasn't just we are a world populated with animals anymore. It was we're a world populated with animals, and those animals come under these specific divisions, and under those divisions, they're under these titles. And we try and do that now with everything. We try and really compartmentalize and categorize everything we do. And because of that, because of our tendency to do that, we approach things like mythology in this very kind of canonical focused way. So it's like we have this obsession with what's the true myth, what's the original myth, what's the actual canon behind all this, what actually happened and such. And when anything deviates away from that or shows any kind of plot hole or error, we kind of we stress out. It's like, this doesn't make sense because this happened earlier. And I think that can sometimes make people struggle. So, one of the primary things with the Mabinogi in general is that we classify the stories, and this is something that's been done since the stories were originally written down. We classify the stories into what we call four branches. So, there's Pedair Cainc y Mabinogi, the four branches of the Mabinogi, four primary stories. And these stories are obviously linked together in a kind of seriality. So they're almost like a television series. They follow in these specific chapters. But there is a tendency for people to assume that means then that they are linear in nature, that they work in this kind of linear timeline or chronological order. And then that causes issues because there
They
are plot
don't.
holes.
Yeah.
If you look at it like that.
They don't do that
So,
at all. Like if you really read them and you follow it, it's like, wait. You're in this branch over here doing this thing, but that character from that branch is in this branch, but this is okay, so we're not in a linear focus. Got it. This is more like a circle, maybe spiral, I don't know. It's some kind of shape, but it's definitely not a straight line. And that was kind of one of the cool things of it's like, wait. Oh, okay. I see what's happening here. I see. I'm getting down with this. Okay. But it was such a fun experience. God, I love the stories. I also love how you get to meet all these amazing characters, but you also get to see the struggles that they go through. And it's from almost this really humanist perspective to where it makes them not so somebody's probably even come for me in the comments on this, but be what it will. It makes them less divine, but not in a bad way. It makes them more approachable and more able to be like, oh, well, you're God. Okay, cool. So that means you understand everything about my life. And it's like, no, I just decided that this dude was really fun to mess around with. And then I married him and he screwed up and then we got divorced. Like, it's such a human perspective to, like, look at it in that way. That's very simplistic, by the way, to everyone. That's, like, the most simplistic way to put that. Don't take that at, like, "Oh, that's what it is." No, that is the most boiled down version of it, to where we have, like, the essence of broth, and it's not even broth anymore. But it's such a beautiful experience to kinda watch all of these different storylines and see how they interplay with each other and see how they're kinda connected and see how like characters like Rhiannon and Gwyn are also kind of interplaying with each other and all these other. I was like, oh my gosh, we could just go on and on and on about it. But there's so many amazing things that I loved about the stories, and I loved how there was so much you could get out of them. But kind of leaning a little bit into that, like, as we talk about, popular retellings and stuff like this, you often kind of hear a little bit about how, like, characters like Rhiannon, and I hope I can say this right, Boldeweth. I hope I got that close. But it and those characters are, you see them a little bit get kind of squished down or put into a box, like they have to fit, like you were saying before, like they have to be compartmentalized. And so how do you think this kind of reduces their archetypes, is, hearing that it's like, oh, well, you took this out of this mythology and then you put it in this box that it may or may not fit in. How does that kind of play into obviously the culture of the Welsh?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because in the very kind of tongue-in-cheek nature that we have to our culture, as I was saying, we like to play with things, we like to poke fun at the things that we do, and we're a bardic storytelling culture, so we like to kind of stretch things and change them and alter them with time. But I think there's a big difference between people within the culture taking something that they know intimately, that they absolutely know to its very core, and playing with it, stretching with it, making new stories up, changing the story slightly, versus people from outside of the culture just kind of cherry picking these characters out from the basket and then doing whatever they want with them. And it's something that I try to talk about a little bit in the book, with the focus on the fact that this is a pagan portal. I try to keep it as somewhat scholarly as I am able to do, because
Mhm.
I'm not a scholar and such. I try to keep the book as in keeping with the actual study of these stories and such, but then in also keeping with the fact that it's a pagan portal book and it's pagans that are going to be reading this, and there are modern day pagans that interact with this material and such. And I try to approach this in a very delicate way in the book, but there is a tendency in modern paganism, when we look at these entities, when we look at these deities, these characters from our stories, to kind of divorce them from their original cultural context and turn them into something entirely new. So, in the example of like Rhiannon. Rhiannon is often labeled online. So if you could look this up right now, you could go on Google and you could type in Rhiannon goddess attributes or something. And,
Mhm.
one of those Pokemon style websites will come up, which give you all the classifications of deities and such, which will tell you which culture she's from, what her story is, what colors are associated with her, what animals are associated with her, and such. And sometimes I do go on those websites or read those types of books. And this is no shade towards the people who do this, but there is sometimes this disconnect, as somebody who is intimately aware of these stories and somebody who comes from that culture. Sometimes I'll read like entries on Rhiannon and I'll just go, where did that come from? And where did this get torn from? And I don't understand why they're saying this about her or that about her. So, for example, I remember I once came across a video on TikTok, of all places, of somebody saying that Rhiannon was the Welsh version of Hecate and that she was the goddess of witchcraft under the moon. And I was sat there thinking, there is nothing in Welsh lore, in Welsh mythology, in these stories that would indicate that. So where is that coming from? And I really find it interesting that this happens quite regularly with Welsh deities. You've got Rhiannon, who often gets turned into this very kind of mysterious, free spirited witch character. I tend to blame Stevie Nicks a little bit for it, but not entirely either. And then there's also like Blodeuwedd, who is sometimes held up on this pedestal as this truly feminist icon, which she is, if you interpret her story in some ways. But then in other versions, she's said to be the Welsh version of Lilith and things. And I'm like, why are we constantly trying to
Whoa.
make Welsh the Welsh version of this or the Welsh version of that? And then, we've got Arianrhod, who she's probably the most misunderstood. She's often portrayed in modern paganism as this starry moon goddess who is very kind of wafty and sensual and magical, but in the story she's a bit stern and she's a bit cold, and there's not really much evidence to link her with the moon and such. And then, of course, the one that people know the most because of people like me ranting about it every year are characters like Mapon, and the way that their names have been pulled out of Welsh culture in order to be planted onto things like the modern neo-pagan Wheel of the Year. So now we have people celebrating the ancient festival of Mabon, even though it's a Welsh god's name and he has nothing to do with the autumn equinox. And actually, that name was only ever given to the autumn equinox by a Wiccan in the 1970s, and prior to that had no association. So it's kind of difficult to give that space for people to have their own relationships, to have their own fun with the stories in the way that we do within Welsh culture, but also to respect the stories and respect the lore as it stands and respect the culture from which it comes from, because there is a tendency to divorce them from the culture and then warp them to fit what people want. And that becomes a little bit tiresome and problematic for us.
It really does. And wow, I'm still reeling about the whole, like, Lilith aspects and Hecate aspects and just going, what? Like, my brain cannot wrap around this. And this is a really important moment for me to kind of give like a minor teaching aspect here of going, the difference between VPG and UPG are not the same. The VPG is verified personal or verified personal gnosis or verified gnosis, basically. And then you have UPG, which is unverified personal gnosis. So the difference between those is, one obviously is the lore, where all these deities have come from, where their history is, and the other one is your experiences with them that may not be 100% canon, but that doesn't mean that it's entirely wrong, but it also doesn't mean it's entirely right. This is why we fact check everything. Just saying. Okay, now that I've said that, I feel better. But also, really? Lilith? Like, also, like, holy colonization, Batman. Okay, we'll circle back to that after we're done recording here, because my brain needs time to process that. Wow. Okay. Yes, please just go read the lore, because honestly, the lore is going to be way more fascinating than you Googling it. Because Googling, you're going to have a very watered down version, kind of like I gave you earlier, where it's like, yes, they did the thing, they married the dude, and then, they got divorced. That is very watered down. It doesn't give you that breadth of everything that happens within the story that makes them who they are. And you get to see them in their full entirety, and you get to see where the aspects of sovereignty come into place, and the aspects of transformation, and that kind of human moral complexity that we were talking about earlier, and the struggles between them, and the struggles between the divine and human. And just read the lore. Like, wow. Okay, moving on from that. As Mhara has so delightfully broken my brain to the point that I'm just like sputtering over here in just sheer chaos of holy TikTok, Batman. So kind of one thing I know that this is a term that has been used, and it probably isn't truly correct, because we really want to use the term Welsh versus the Christianized and Roman versions. But there's obviously some debate of how Celtic or Welsh the Mabinogi brain, hello. The beautiful things that apparently my brain cannot. I'm sitting here reading the word and my brain's like, no, we're not going to spit that out because it's Welsh and not English. Mabinogi, there we go. Versus Christianized and post-Roman, and how their kind of surviving versions have been like changed and all that. And what is your kind of perspective on how that tension has kind of gone about, and how does it fit in the modern world? How do we move away from the colonization and bring it back to what it originally was? I mean, obviously you're doing a beautiful job with your books because of that. But obviously there's still some, colonization out there that is happening. And how do we keep that from happening going forward to keep the culture pure of what it actually is and where it came from?
Yeah, it's such a complicated topic because, even within the realms of academia nowadays and such, people like me are kind of frowned upon because we have a tendency to frame these stories as mythologies that are part and package of our culture that potentially hold and carry echoes of something far, far older than the Christianized versions that we have today of the stories.
Hmm.
So we know, for example, from reading the stories and looking at the way the stories are presented, that they represent a period in time that is prior to Christianity. So if we look at the actual themes of the stories, if we look at the locations, if we look at the way in which the stories are presented, then we are given a snapshot of Wales or Britain prior to the various different splitting into different little regions and countries and such. We are given this image of a landscape which is not Christian. It's definitely not a Christian landscape. It's pre Christian. And also, it's before the Romans came because the Romans are never mentioned. And the Romans were a really important and huge aspect of our history. So they wouldn't just kind of be ignored, they'd constantly be there. We were governed over by the Romans. The
Hmm.
Romans provided us with our laws, our customs, our culture, and such at one point when they came and made us part of the Roman Empire. So the fact that none of that is mentioned, there are no kind of forts associated with Romans, there are no Roman soldiers, there are no Roman emperors mentioned ever, implies that not only is this a pre-Christian era, but this is pre the Roman era of Britain as well. This is quite deep into the past. But we know that it's kind of close-ish based on a few hints here and there. It's close to when the Romans were coming. They're nearby, they're close, but they're not quite here yet. So that gives us a really interesting point of time because it's a pre-Christian pagan era specifically, and it's also before the landscape of Britain was ravaged by the Roman Empire. So that gives us a little bit of a clue that these are older stories as well. However, the hiccup comes along when you look at the texts as we have them today. So, Welsh culture, or pre Christian kind of Brythonic culture, which is what Welsh evolved out of, we didn't like to write things down. We were an oral culture, an oral tradition.
Hmm.
And so our stories were shared from mouth to ear instantly. Like they were told by storytellers, by bards, by keepers of law. They were told by people who had essentially their entire lives oriented around keeping these stories and telling these stories, keeping those elements of lore alive. And in that kind of context, we don't have very old, ancient versions of these stories because we didn't bother to write things down. We didn't see it as something that was needed. We thought the spoken word and story was sacred as something that you experienced, not read. And so it's only after writing became commonplace that we start finding written versions of these stories. So the oldest written versions of these stories that we have date to around possibly the 6th or 7th centuries, which by that point, Britain has already been turned into a Christian area. The Christianity has already seeped into the landscape, and you see that reflected in the texts
Hmm.
because there's mention of God and such. The actual manuscripts that we have now that we could go and look at and touch and read from nowadays are actually dated to even a later period than that, around the 13th or 14th century. But we know that those 13th and 14th century manuscripts are copies of copies of copies of copies. And they've been constantly copied down and slightly altered, maybe, but they've been copied from much older manuscripts. We know that based on the language that's being used and such, and the evolution of language in general. So, because of that, because the actual written versions we have now are rooted in a post Christianity coming to Britain time period, there are some people who argue that there is nothing pagan about these stories. despite the fact, like I said, it's set in a world that's obviously pre-Christian, and that's obviously a world prior to the Romans coming as well. On top of that, there are some hints that they are very much echoes of something much older. The primary place that I love to focus on when we're talking about hints of something that is pre Christian are the names of some of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we have names like Mabon. We'll bring him up again because he's one of the easiest to look at. So, Mabon, for example, is Mabon ap Modron in Welsh, and that just means Mabon, the son of Modron. And when we translate his name can literally be translated into English to mean the divine son or the god-like son or the great son, depending on the translation you look at, of the divine mother, of the great mother. So he is literally the great son of the great mother, and that on at the end of their names, Mabon,
Mm-hmm.
Modron, we know that that on denotes divinity. It denotes something godlike or great in its quality, something that is revered and worshipped and venerated. So the divine son of the divine mother, Mabon ap Modron, within this post-Christianization, quite early Christian manuscripts and such. And then we go back through time, through history, even prior to the coming of what we would eventually call Welsh culture to our ancestor culture, the Brythonic culture and such. And we look to certain regions of that also have a Brythonic culture, and suddenly we find references to the god Maponos. Maponos, Mapon, they sound kind of similar, but on top of that, they mean the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Mapon, divine son, Maponos, the divine son, again. And they have qualities that are associated with each other. So, Mapon in Welsh mythology, in these manuscripts that are rooted in a Christian culture, is a child of a divine mother of some sort who is stolen away. And then later on in the story, he's associated with things like hunting, poetry, healing, and then Maponos, the old pre Christian god of certain regions of Europe and Britain. He was venerated as a god of healing, poetry, hunting, all of these things. So we have these two entities that are clearly the same entity. It's just that one has been changed slightly as we bring it into a more modernized era at that time. And then there's another goddess that we can look at called Matrona. And Matrona, again, like Modron in Welsh, Matrona means divine mother. So you've got Mabon ap Modron and then Maponos and Matrona. So we've got these deities that are very much pre-Christian deities that were worshipped and venerated in the ancient world. And here we have a reflex of them in a later Christianized culture. So to me and to some scholars, there is evidence from looking at that obviously the names were carried over, that certain elements of their characteristics were carried over. So to me, Mapon is just a later Welsh reflex of this ancient god that was once worshipped and venerated. But some don't think that that's enough evidence. And Mapon's not the only one. There's plenty of other characters as well that also have these reflexes that seem to imply that they are associated with older deities. There's also a lot that we can compare the Welsh texts to even earlier pre-Christian Irish texts and such. So there's similarities there as well. So to me, there's enough evidence to indicate that the Mabinogi, at the very least, carry an echo of something that is ancient, that is pre-Christian in its nature, that is pagan in its nature. How much exactly is carried in the Mabinogi, we might never know. But the important thing for me personally is the realization and the acknowledgement that, beyond all this, beyond the conversation of are they ancient stories, are they ancient mythologies that predate Christianity, are they just medieval stories, and are the characters even gods? Beyond those questions from a kind of historical, antiquated point of view, we also have to acknowledge that I, myself, and a lot of people who do venerate these characters from the Mabinogi as gods today, we are not ancient people from the ancient world. We are
Mm-hmm.
modern people who are situated in the very modern world. And when we have these conversations about are the characters in the Mabinogi actually gods? Are these stories actually ancient mythologies? I think one thing that gets forgotten is that to the modern pagan mindset, that doesn't actually matter that much because whether or not we can prove with absolute certainty that Rhiannon was an ancient goddess in the pre Christian world, the fact of the matter is she is now. She
Hmm.
absolutely is a goddess today. There are temples dedicated to her, there are people who have altars set up to her in their homes. And I would argue that that is the culmination of a process of apotheosis, which is the process of making something divine, which we see happen in a lot of ancient cultures across the world. You know, the ancient Romans, they would apotheosize their leaders, their commanders, their emperors, and such to godlike status eventually, and then they'd be worshipped as gods. We know that in certain cultures, such as the culture of Egypt and Greece, they apotheosized certain figures from literature or mythology to godlike status. So we're not alone in doing this. So even if the academics turn around and say, oh, there's absolutely no evidence that Rhiannon was a goddess in the ancient world, my argument is always, but that doesn't matter because she is today. She very
Hmm.
much touches people today. And obviously, people are feeling her presence and getting something out of a relationship with her. So, even if we cannot prove the antiquity, and we have to acknowledge we can't disprove it either, we do know that she is a goddess today. And that goddess like status comes from the culmination of the process of apotheosis, which I would argue began much longer than how long these manuscripts have been in our disposal. So Rhiannon, as a specific example, she has been utilized as a character in Welsh tradition and culture who has been elevated onto almost divine status throughout all of time.
Hmm.
She's this otherworldly character who carries the tenacious and, constant battling spirit of the Welsh culture in general. She's resilient, she's cunning, she's magical. And that's something that I think represents us as Welsh people as well, despite everything that we go through, despite all the attempts that there has been to suppress our language, we're still here. And that's the spirit of Rhiannon. So it makes sense to me that she has been elevated as this story character that speaks to us on a very, very visceral level, and why, from around the turn of the 20th century onwards, she was absolutely venerated as a goddess by a variety of people. And I don't deny that she might have been in the past as well. So it's a complicated topic and one that I kind of touch upon in the book, but
Yes.
it's murky waters to deal with.
It is murky waters to deal with, and I think that it's important even now to have these types of conversations to make sure that we are actually truly understanding where things have come from, but also acknowledging how they've changed in the modern world, because that gives us the opportunity to see how these beings, these entities have grown with humanity as well, that they're not just some stagnant pedestal made of stone, that they're, living beings that live through our cultures and our lives and how we work with them. So I think that that's a really fascinating thing. Now, before we run out of time, I definitely want to talk about your other book, Welsh Fairy Lore, because it was fantastic. Like I said, I've read it twice. I love the book. It was amazing. I, can't get over how great it was because, and also like, if you are somebody that likes fairies and likes history and likes just, good mythology and lore altogether, go buy it right now. Stop what you're doing, pause the podcast, go buy it because it's that good. Trust me. um, but obviously, there's a lot of fairy lore that, goes all across the world. Everybody has their own version of fairies or some kind of fae-like beings throughout their own cultures. So, how does Welsh fairy lore obviously differ more commonly from like Irish or Scottish or even like, say, Norse, for example? Like, how would that happen? And what makes them more distinct to kind of, differentiate them?
Oh gosh. Well, I wouldn't say that they are wholly distinct because a lot of these cultures, they have a lot of similarities,
Hmm.
especially when we're talking about our cousins, our siblings. If we're looking at Cornwall and Brittany, which are very much Brythonic nations, they are very similar. And then Ireland and Scotland have very similar but different approaches to fairies. We can definitely see the connections and such. I would say the main way in which people kind of have this misconception about fairies when it comes to looking at them from the more generalized Celtic kind of way of seeing them, is that a lot of ideas we have about fairies in the modern world do not relate or match with what we think of in actual folklore and mythology. So when we talk about fairies within a Welsh context, and I've come across this quite a lot when I talk to people about my book, it's this tendency that people have to assume that fairy folklore is either all about kind of these flower like fairy beings or these elemental spirits and entities, or that it is these kind of twee folklore creatures, kind of like Santa's workshop elves and such. And when I then go on to explain that no, when we look at fairies in a more traditional Welsh context, they're more like gods. They're more like divine beings that come from the other world. So I always try and push people to buy my second book because I've had a lot of people tell me, oh, I like that you've written a book on fairies, but I'm not personally into fairies. I'm going to buy your books on gods and goddesses and witchcraft instead. And in those moments, I just feel like dying inside because I'm like, but fairy folklore is all to do with gods and witchcraft and magic and such. That's all embedded into it. It's not just a book about, twee little creatures dancing in the moonlight. It's not a book on stories and such. There are plenty of those out there. It's a book that deals with that correlation between polytheism, paganism, and also witchcraft and folk magic and fairy folklore, and how these things are actually, from a Welsh perspective and on a broader Celtic perspective, are deeply intimately intertwined with one another. So I would argue that you can't really practice Welsh witchcraft or Welsh magic in particular, magic that is drawn from the wellspring of Welsh culture, without touching on fairies a little bit. They are
Mhm.
such an important and integral aspect of our ideas of the other world, of our ideas surrounding Awen, this divine movings force that kind of almost moves the way in which we practice magic and our bardic arts and such in our world. They are part and package of all those things. Within a more witchcraft and folk magic perspective, fairies were often the driving forces. So I know from a more folk magical, folkloric witchcraft perspective, there is quite an obsession at the minute with, the idea of witchcraft and witches being associated with pacts. That's to do with pacts between the witch and the devil, or the witch and familiar spirits and such. And I always feel like telling people, when it comes to Welsh culture, we have very little lore surrounding pacts with the devil or demons, but we have a lot of folklore and a lot of history associating pacts between witches and magical practitioners in a broader sense. And fairies, they were essentially our familiar spirits and such. So, to me, the main place that fairies really differ in a Welsh context is how intimately connected they are with absolutely everything. So if we're looking at Awen and the divine inspiring force of all creation within the Welsh context, then fairies are there. The other world is there. If we're looking at the other world in general and the concept of the other in Welsh, fairies are going to show up. If we're looking at gods, some of our gods and goddesses are fairies. Rhiannon is a goddess, but she's also a fairy creature. Gwyn ap Nudd is king of fairy, but he's also a god of liminality and such. So there's these intimate connections between all things. And even when we get to things like magic, the very practice of magic is deeply intimately connected with the concept of the other, and by that extension, fairies as well. So it kind of ties everything together. And it's why I wanted to look into them, because even on kind of beyond the confines of witchcraft, I've even spoken to people who practice herbalism and herbal healing through a Welsh perspective, because we have a culture and a tradition of specific herbal medicine and healing over here. And even that, the origin story of where we learnt those healing methods and such, link to fairy folklore.
Mhm.
So literally everything seems to come back to fairies eventually. And it's why I wanted to write that book, because I wanted people to be more aware of just how intimately woven into every aspect of our being fairy folklore is. It's not just twee nature spirits, it's not just creatures in the woods, it's not just scary fae who will come and eat your face if you offend them. They're everywhere. They're part
Mhm.
and package absolutely everything. And I think that's one place we are quite unique, and one place that people might somehow struggle with sometimes.
You know, I love that though, but like I said, I ate up the whole book on fairies because I loved it so much because there's you're not joking when you literally say fairies are ingrained in all aspects of Welsh mythology and Welsh witchcraft and the divine work and even just everyday work like how people survived and how people live and even after their influence still bled through into Christian practice in the world of the Welsh and everything else. So like you see all of these different little aspects and they don't go away at all.
Mm.
So they're still ingrained there and I loved it so much. I also loved how much like I was seeing how in the book of fairies how it also kind of was like I don't even know if this ever happened, but this is how it happened in my brain that literally other cultures came and your group of people, the Welsh, and like all the other groups of people came over and it's like, hey, I know that story. We have one of those. We just call that guy over here this name instead. And the difference correlations is or correlations between the different mythologies and all that just it made my little mythology loving heart just go, oh my God, look, it's that story over here, but he's named over here and it's almost the same. I love it. I completely nerded out on it. Um, in fact, one of my favorite stories, and I love that you really go deep into the lore of Gwyn ap Neath. And how he's psychopomp. He's kind of the leader of this wild hunt in Welsh lore. And he's kind of a god, kind of not a god, somewhere between a fae, a god, and just a dude that got really lucky with a lot of stuff. So he's so amazing. And the stories of how he encompasses everything and how he ends up kind of becoming this, quote unquote, king of the fairies. But he's also, works with the dead and works with quote unquote demons, but that's Christianized, but, and how it all kind of plays into that. But I also really loved how you really broke down the wild hunt because that's not in a whole lot of witchcraft books. And I wish it was because it's really fascinating how it actually spans so many cultures, but it's not talked about much. So, in line with that, how would you view that modern practitioners could honor, Gwyn's role within not just the myth, but also part of living spiritual practice, especially in terms of like the wild hunt and everything else? Because, you have this beautiful ritual of how you might bring him into your life and how you might like start to honor him. And obviously, pay him a lot of respect because you never know what he might do. But how do you kind of, view that and how do you think that people could actually bring those kind of practices more deep into a modern practice versus, just keeping it traditional?
Mm. Well, Gwyn, to me, I think, is the perfect bridge for anybody who is wanting to practice magic, wanting to practice witchcraft. He is this almost shadowy entity, and he is one that is loaded with contradiction. And because of that, I always joke about that. To me, he embodies the queer, and I don't mean queer in kind of like a homosexual way right now. I'm talking about like queer in the very definition of the term, as in something that is almost unknowable and strange and out there and other, and yet contradictingly familiar
Hmm.
and very kind of intimate to us. And to me, as somebody who exists in this strange world of, I'm a Welsh speaker, but my work is predominantly within the realms of English speaking peoples, and I have to kind of alter the way I talk in order to fit in that place. So I'm straddling two worlds there. I'm a queer person who operates in a world that is predominantly ruled over by non queer people. And as such, I have to straddle like, do I let my true persona out or do I try and diminish myself and mask myself to keep myself safe? And so I'm straddling two worlds there. And, there's so many different versions of myself that I kind of have to straddle two worlds constantly. And Gwyn kind of is that in in the most extreme of ways, to the point where within like certain circles of astrology lovers here in Wales, they call the constellation of Gemini, the twins, Gwyn and Gwythyr here. So he's associated with Gemini, which I always find fun because I am a Gemini. So to me, it's like that's the way that Gwyn embodies everything. It's the way that he exists and expresses himself. He is this bridge between two things. He is this middle point. And I love that when we were talking earlier about the way in which sometimes people took these characters and these entities and kind of divorced them from their Welsh culture and made them into something that they weren't, like they did with Rhiannon, Blodeuwedd, with Arianrhod and such. With Gwyn ap Nudd, they tried to do that, but they kind of, got it right in doing that as well, because that's Gwyn's nature. If you
Mhm.
say that he is X, somebody will come to argue that he is Y, but the reality is that he's something in between those two things. And so when Gwyn ap Nudd was adopted into modern paganism, he was said to be the British or the Welsh expression of the horned god of the witches. He was a devil like folkloric figure who entices you into the realms of magic and witchcraft. He is the guardian at the mound who protects you from the perils of the other world, but also allows you entry if it's your time to get into the other world and such. And all of these things are really kind of amped up theatrical versions of who Gwyn is within our mythology and our culture. And yet they're not wrong either. He's kind of all of those things. So it's just kind of like, oh, yeah, I can see where that came from. It's not quite as egregious as the things that are said about Rhiannon or Arianrhod and such. It kind of makes some semblance of sense. So to me, and the way that I would always recommend that people approach Gwyn is as an initiator into the mysteries. He is that which exists between the worlds, and that is the place of magic. That is the place where all magic tends to happen, you know? Magic doesn't happen, at least in my experience, in the extremes. I'm very vocally quite against the idea of, trying to see the world in black and white, in binary patterns and such. I think magic, and true initiation into the mysteries of life in general, when we're looking at it from a pagan and witchcraft perspective, happens when we acknowledge the betwixt and the between, the liminal, the strange place that embodies that in between all things. So it's not this or that, it's not that way or this way, it's the middle. It's that path that is crooked. It's that path that doesn't quite make sense to the ordinary mind, but to the initiated makes complete sense. It's the untreaded path through the woods. And that is where Gwyn ap Nudd is situated. So I would always recommend that if people want to connect with him in any way or want to feel his presence, to go out into some deep, dark forest at a liminal time, sunset, sunrise, midnight, if you're brave enough, and such. And you will feel him just there because that is his domain. There are certain practices in the past associated with him. So even through to the 14th century, it was said that Welsh people would stop at the edge of the forest and they would recite a prayer to Gwyn ap Nudd in order to be able to enter into the forest safely and not be fooled by the trickster-like spirits that reside in the shadows and such, that Gwyn would place his protection over you. So I incorporate something like that. I always give him a nod whenever I'm about to enter into a place that I consider his domain. So to me, that's forests, woodlands, but also any liminal state or place. So I always give him a nod in those moments. And I think the interesting thing about Gwyn is that he can be pretty much anything you want him to be because he is this contradictory mishmash spirit. When we look at him in the oldest texts that we have associated with him, he's this rugged, scary, fighting like character who does rather horrid things to people sometimes, like killing a man and then forcing that man's son to eat his heart and
Mhm.
such. So that's quite intense. But then as we get like closer to folklore and such, he becomes almost a flamboyant and comedic character. He's dressed in silks all the time and he has these grand feasts and he's surrounded by all these twinky, lovely little boys who like tend to his every need and such. So I love that kind of duality of he is this rugged, scary character, but also this flamboyant and very opulent king of fairy as well. He is this twee fairy king, but he's also the scary retriever of souls who flies out on his carriage every Norse Galan Gaeaf to collect the souls of the dead that died that past year. So he is everything and nothing all at once. And I think when it comes to characters like Gwyn, when it comes to deities like Gwyn, it's important to me that I make clear to people when they ask me how to connect with him and such, that to me, Gwyn is an experience. It's not something like, I've never really felt the need to build an altar to Gwyn or to have tools to help connect me to him. But in those moments where I'm out in the woods and it's sunset or twilight and you can sense that there's something other in the air, and suddenly in that moment you see something out of the corner of your eye and it sends a shiver down your spine. And it's in those moments that I go, oh, there he is. There's Gwyn. And also in those moments where I'm empowered and I'm practicing magic and I can feel the flow of that magic weaving its way into the world from something other, and I'm the bridge between that other and reality. To me, that's the moment that I feel Gwyn within me as well. So I would kind of take the lore that is written in books like mine, if you do tend to pick up a copy or anything like that, and I would look for Gwyn through the things that are obviously associated with him, but also in those moments, those betwixt and between moments that give you that genuine true feel of witchcraft in its most transgressive and liminal form, if that makes any sense.
That makes beautiful sense, and, like, you coulda just kept going, and I would have just sat here mesmerized in how beautiful that was because, yes, like, I loved when I was reading about him, like, one of my favorite things was obviously I'm a priestess of Loki, so, having that I saw a lot of Loki in him, but I also saw a lot of Odin in him, and my husband works with Odin, so, like, both of those figures are very prominent in our household, but seeing both of those, attributes kind of embodied in him. And I'm like, huh, okay, that's cool. Like, I see this in you and I see that in you. And I'm like, did you guys just sit down and compare notes and be like, this is our God, but that's also your God? And they're the same dude, just going by different names. Like, that's how it feels sometimes, but it was such a beautiful experience. And I'm just like, I don't even know this guy, and I'm, like, kind of infatuated by him, like, he's really cool, and I love the mythos behind him, I loved everything that came with him, I loved his aspects of the other world, which, we'll talk about in just a moment, um, but, like, he's such an amazing character, and the fact that he bridges that liminality between the two worlds, and I love how you talk about, how he's also kind of like this spirit that really comes to life, especially with people who are like neurodivergent or who are queer or any of those aspects, those places where you are in those liminal spaces where you don't quite belong in one world or the other. You're in kind of this space between both. And he's just kind of the spirit that's like, yeah, hi, I'm here with you. What's up? How's it going? And I'm like, that's so awesome. Like, I love that. I actually highlighted it in the book and like have it tabbed, and there's annotation notes next to it. So yes. Which I don't annotate my books unless I really love them, intend on keeping them forever and making sure they like get passed down through the lineage of my line. So yeah, I'm kind of a book snob in that way. But so if I do that, that book's not leaving my home ever. And there's probably 2 or 3 dozen tabs in Mhara's book of Welsh Fairies. So definitely, absolutely pick up a copy. Kind of talking a little bit about the Welsh Otherworld. And this is going to be our last question because we are actually out of time and I just have to ask. It kind of appears in such a way that there's obviously this beautiful place that is got danger and promise, and it's testing you, and it's also kind of the place of the dead, and it's kind of not, and it's everything all encompassed into this amazing magical place. So how do you see the other world showing up in modern practice, and do you think it actually has a place in modern practice, or does it just serve as a place of initiation and transformation?
Well, to me personally, I think it serves a really prominent place in modern day practice. And I think we sometimes touch the other world without really realizing it quite frequently. So, within, as you were saying, in Welsh tradition, it is this place of plenty, but also this place of mystery, this place of challenge and such. And, I always try and present the other world in the various expressions that it tends to take through various lenses that we have within our culture. And I like to, because again, we live in a world where we love to compartmentalize and break things down, and I'm guilty of that too. I love it. I like to be able to explain things as succinctly as possible. And the other world I've found has three primary expressions if we compare our mythologies, our poetry, our songs, our culture, and such, in the way that it presents itself. The other world has three primary expressions. There's the other world of mythology, and in the other world of mythology, it is a literal place that you can visit, that you can go to. It's not too dissimilar to our world. It's a place that you can just kind of wander into, walk into, sometimes by accident, and it's a place that is almost like a mirror image of our world, but everything is just that tiny bit better. Everything is just like, kind of like if you place an Instagram filter over it, it's like it's just that tiny bit more vivid, tiny bit nicer, tiny bit more pleasant. So it's kind of like, if you can visualize, it's almost as though you're in this world, the world that we currently occupy, but Donald Trump was never born. So it's that
Oh.
kind of feeling. Everything's just a little better. But it's still a place of the living. It's not this paradisical heaven. There is still death, there is still war, there is still battle, there is still challenge, and there is still conflict. So it's not entirely this paradisical heaven like place, but it's not this hellish place either. The other world of folklore, in contrast, is again a literal physical place that you can visit. You usually slip into the other world by falling into deep, dark lakes or wandering too far into a cave, or sometimes you'll find a door at the edge of a lake or a river. Usually, bodies of water are mentioned. And, sometimes it's an island out at sea and such. And in the folkloric context, this is the realm of fairies. So, yes, it's a place of beauty and grandeur, but it's also a place that's really scary. But it also, because folklore tends to traverse into Christianity and such, and Christian cosmology, it became synonymous with the concept of hell, which doesn't really make much sense because, again, though it is a place that has a few dangers and a few scary aspects, it's still quite lovely to go there. It's still quite pretty. But to Christian culture, they were just like, well, there's this realm, and it's not heaven, and it's not paradisical and perfect, so it must be hell, I guess. So they kind of made it associated with hell, but in the broader sense, it's just the realm where fairies and other supernatural type creatures come from. It's the place where the other resides. It's that place that's just beyond the shadows. So I don't know if anybody else experiences this, but when you're falling asleep at night in a dark room and you can't fall asleep, so you open your eyes and you stare into the corner. And as you stare into the corner, it kind of gets darker and darker, and sometimes shapes start to form in the
Hmm.
shadows and such. And then you blink and they're gone. And that's the other world of folklore. The other world of folklore is a place of illusion and fear, but sometimes beauty and magic as well. And then there's the other world of the bards. And the other world of the bards is, to me, one of the most interesting because the other world of the bards is the birthplace of all poetic and divine inspiration. So, we as Welsh people, our culture is inherently linked to poetry, to the arts, to music, and such. It's the most defining and important feature of who we are as a nation. It's in our national anthem. We're a Gwlad Beir dda Chantorion. We're a country filled with bards and singers. Our biggest cultural festival every year is a festival that is predominantly about poetry, but also the arts in a broader sense, in the sense of music and dance and things like that. So the arts have always been celebrated in Welsh culture and have always been seen as divine in nature and magical in nature as well. And it was said that the greatest bards, the greatest poets, the greatest singers were touched by this force called Awen. And Awen moves through our world like a breeze or like a river that flows through the air. But it comes originally from the other world. It comes and emanates from the cauldron of Ceridwen or through the other world in the way in which the other world is intimately connected with our world. And as it moves from the other world, which according to some of the old poetry, it's formed by divine hands in the other world and then pushed out, and it makes its way into our world like a gentle breeze, and then we breathe it in in, and as we breathe it in, it fuses and takes hold of our humanity. And it's that fusion, that divine, otherworldly, magical essence mixed with who we are as humans and our experience as physical beings, which then, when we start to move in the world, we will essentially birth the Awen back to life, usually in the form of either poetry, prophecy, or magic. Those are the three ways in which Awen tends to show itself in our world: poetry or art in a broader sense, prophecy, which is the art of being able to tell the future, to be able to sing of what is to come in the future, so divination essentially, or magic, the way in which people change things from one thing to the other. So magic in a transformative sense. So to me, the Awen is constantly flowing through me whenever I am practicing magic, whenever I'm writing invocations, poetry, prayers, whenever I'm moving in an artistic way. I try and feel the Awen, because it's in those moments that I feel like I create the most beautiful pieces of art and such. And when I don't feel that flow of Awen, I always feel like something is missing from my work. Similarly, when I'm practicing divination, that prophetic kind of art, I feel the Awen flow through me. And also, when I'm holding ritual or practicing magic, the Awen is there. It is present in me at all times. And I'm constantly reminded that that Awen comes initially from the other world, this liminal, strange place that is beyond our comprehension entirely, to the point where we have various different expressions of what this place might be. So that's the way that the other world kind of plays a role to me in my life as a magical practitioner, as a polytheist, as a druid, whatever label I assign to myself day by day. That's how the Awen and the other world tends to take form. It's in the actions that I do through magic and through prophecy and through art. There's three primary things that show up in my practice. There, none of them would exist without that Awen flowing through me first. And to try and create something without the flow of Awen being present is to create something that is essentially void and empty of all emotion and all depth. And interestingly, saying depth there, devoid of depth, the word that we use in Welsh tradition for the other world. So in English, we say other world, and it's just the world that is othered to our own. It's
Mhm.
that place beyond our world. But in Welsh, what we call it is anofn. And anofn translates instead to the very deep, or the very depths of all things. And when we look at those three kind of expressions of the other world, this physical place that's opulent and just a bit better than our world, but still very much a reflection of our world, this fairy realm, or this place of divine inspiration, when we look at it through those three lenses, the very deep makes sense to all three. Because on one hand, you've got a place where things are considered on a much more deeper level, and therefore things are just that tiny bit better. You've got this physical fairy realm, which is accessed via the deep, via water, via caves, via rivers, via the ocean and such. And then you've got this place where it delves into the very depth of our being, so the depth of our existence. And by basically digging into the very depths of our soul, we birth something transformative into the world, whether that is art that touches people at their hearts and moves them and makes it so that they change the way they move in the world and touch other people, or whether it is prophecy, which changes the way that people perceive what might come in the future, that gives you a deeper perspective of what you could potentially be in for as time goes forward, or whether that's magic, literal transformation, the changing of one thing into the other via our artistry in the magical practice and ritual. So, through all of those things, the depths, or the very deep of all things, makes profound sense. And so, to me, my magic, my practice needs to have that quality of depth, needs to have that quality of the other world present at all times. So I'd say it's quite important to pretty much everything we do.
I love that, and I love it, all of those descriptions of it. And the fun thing is, like, my brain, obviously, when you hear bardic traditions or you need like a bard type thing, my brain immediately goes to D&D. And I was just like, yes, we'll go play the bard. And that's where my brain goes. And I'm like, well, maybe that's where that originated from. But either way, I love it. And I love how that happens. And I love the connection to it. And I you're gonna have to come back because we're gonna just have to talk more because we are actually over time and I love it and I'm just enjoying all of the conversation that we're having. So you're gonna have to come back so we can do it again. But before we end for the day, what are you working on that you can, tease or share about if you can? B, what events do you have coming up that you'd like everybody to know about? And C, where can people find you on social media?
Oh, goodness. Well, what am I working on currently? As I mentioned earlier, I've got 3 books that are already out, but one book which is currently in the works and it should be releasing in around May of 2026. And I say in the works, it's already written, it's already done, it's just going through edits at the moment.
Mhm.
That book is my second book via Moon Books. It's longer than my Pagan Portals of Mabinogi. It's a much longer book, and it's called Pantheon the Welsh, and it's part of Moonbooks' Pantheon series, which initially I was a little nervous about whether I needed to contribute something for that. I was asked and approached by Moonbooks whether I'd write a Welsh version of the Pantheon series. So some of you might already know that Moonbooks has, like, Pantheon the Irish and Pantheon the Norse and Pantheon the Greeks and such, where they introduce the reader to the Norse pantheon, the Greek pantheon, obviously, and such. So I'm writing the Welsh version, introducing the world to Welsh deities. So I like to dub it as Pantheon the Welsh / Welsh deities, my Welsh deities book. So it talks about the cosmology of magic and mythology and divination and deities and all that sort of thing within the Welsh cultural context. And then the second part of the book acts essentially as almost like a dictionary of gods or deities or mythological characters and spiritual entities and such from our culture. So that book releases, strangely, the day after my birthday in May of 2026. So do pre-order that. It's already up for pre-order wherever books are sold now. Beyond that, I'm also contracted to write one more book, and I'm writing another book, hopefully, for Llewellyn, if Llewellyn take it. Hopefully they will. And that book is something that I'm really excited to share with the world, but not something that I can talk about now. So you'll have to come find me on my socials and keep an eye out for that one and the announcement of that one. I'm always running courses and classes via my Patreon. So if that's something that interests you and you want to learn more about Welsh magic from a absolute lunatic like myself, then do come seek me out on Patreon because I love to share the magic and lore of Wales. So just go on patreon.com/Mhara Starling for my classes, courses, workshops, articles, everything. I'm like a rash. So once you've rubbed up against me, there's no getting rid of me. So you will find me everywhere now. I've got YouTube videos, I've got podcast episodes, and yeah, come find me and you'll see the weird and wonderful world of Welsh witchery and magic.
I love that. And I'm excited that you're, contracted to write another book with Llewellyn. We love Llewellyn around here, obviously, because I have your Welsh Fairies book. But I'm excited about your Welsh Pantheons book as well with Moon Books. That's going to be exciting. I'm going to have to get a copy of that. And when it comes out, you're going to have to come back and we're going to have to talk about it. But also, in case it's a while before then, happy birthday about getting a new book published. So yay. Yes. So everybody, make sure you go follow Mhara. I was reading and completely butchered your name. I apologize about that. Mhara Starling, everyone. Please go follow Mhara everywhere on social media. And I hope that you will do that because Mara's videos are amazing, by the way. I have unofficially stalked Mhara forever on social media because I love the content. It's fun, it's exciting, it's silly. It is such a good time. You will never be bored and you will always get to learn some really great stuff about the Welsh culture, Welsh witchcraft, mythology, fairies, everything in between, the bardic traditions, all of the above. It is fantastic stuff. I love it. And obviously, I will leave you with one of my favorite things that I learned from Mara many, many years ago is if you're somebody that has the boobies, go flash the boobies at somebody and hex them because that's a Welsh thing. And I love it. And it's still my favorite thing to this day about that. So it's been awesome. Mara, please come back again so we can talk more.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you'll have me. Thank you so much
Oh,
again for
don't tell
having
me
me.
that, because I'll have you anytime. Anytime on the show you want to come back, you'll just be like, hey, can we come talk about this? Yes, absolutely. I don't even know where we're going to talk about, but we will talk about it. You just tell me when and where, and I will be there because it'll be awesome. To everyone who's listened, thank you so much for listening to the show. Please follow Mara, buy the books. You will love them. And go nuts. It's great. It's all amazing stuff. You're never going to be bored with it. It's so fascinating. And take care of yourselves. Be kind to each other. Be kind to yourselves, especially in this crazy world. And I will see you all next time for another episode. Bye-bye, everyone. Hello, friends. So, as you know, I do a lot of community work as well, in addition to the show. So if you're looking to deepen your practice with and connect with like-minded witches like myself, or even get your questions answered, you should join the Discord. And the Discord has this beautiful community that I have built, and it offers some really great opportunities for witches to connect. Once a month we host temple hours. I know, silly name, but it's true. We host a open discussion where you can ask your witchcraft, paganism, or even spiritual questions. And if you're curious about deity work, spellcraft, or if you just want to chat with other fellow practitioners like myself, because I usually will be there, Temple Hours is a space where you can come and learn and grow. The other one that we offer is the Divine Gathering. So every week we host a public devotional circle to honor our gods, share offerings, and strengthen our spiritual connections with the divine. So no matter who you work with, no matter where you are in your practice, this is a time for reverence and community support. So you should totally come join us in the Raven's Nook. It's a great place. It's a warm community. It is very welcoming, very chill and relaxed. And if you want to join us, which I hope that you will, there's a link in the show description, and I can't wait to see you there. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you all next time.